welcome back after that quick comfort break. Thank you for staying with us, and welcome back to our third and final session this morning, looking at soil, carbon and water. We're going to start this session with Penny Anderson, who is chair of the board of Penny Anderson Associates and retired managing director. She's going to talk about some work she's been doing on carbon across habitats with a focus on grasslands. So welcome, Penny, and thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and delighted to see so many people here. I feel quite overawed, I think. Presumably you can hear me okay, so that's
yes.
Fine.
Yeah.
I just want to say basically that what I've been doing is actually reviewing the carbon, soils and habitats, and that's basically being part of the 2030 climate change group, which is one of the subgroups of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. And the overall paper that I produced out of that is available for anybody, and there's a link there if you want to use it. I must stress, though, that I'm not an expert on carbon at all. I'm an ecologist specialist in habitat creation and restoration, and particularly on peatlands, actually, which is where a lot of the carbon interest came from. But I think what our reaction in the group basically came from the government mantra and actually also from the Climate Change Committee, was to plant trees, but also restore the peatland. Peatland bit's fine, but planting trees everywhere is not the only solution. And we were just concerned that they would be the wrong tree in the wrong place. So that's why I started exploring what else could be useful in terms of habitat. And I think one of the major conclusions, which everybody's talking about as well, is that much of what you can do in terms of sequestrating carbon will also benefit ecosystem services. Just a few figures here and a few things to point out as well. I'm sure most of you know much of what I'm saying actually today has already been explained by a lot of other people, but perhaps I'm just trying to pull it together. That globally there's 3 to 5 times more carbon in soils than vegetation, which just stresses the importance of the vegetation, and that's much more, stresses the importance of the soils, and that too is very much more than in the atmosphere. And what I've just done here is just to pick out some of the figures that I've collated on the carbon stock in habitats and soils. And apart from the woody vegetation, you can see how really important the soils are for carbon. And this is a stock. And don't forget that stock could actually be increasing or decreasing over time, and that's quite important. But just to pick out a few figures, the soils, peatland in particular, when it's deep, peat is very high concentrated carbon, much of which is being lost at a high rate from a lot of peatlands, particularly agricultural ones in the country. But then your humic alluvial glaze soils come out really at the top, and then you go down the system, if you like, through pod soils, attic grassland soils, and then down to neutral and calcareous grassland soils. And there's far less carbon in the calcareous grassland soils than in some of the others. But the other thing to point out is that an awful lot of papers vary enormously, which has been mentioned too today, on the depth of soil that they look at their carbon in. So some of the material that came from the Milne paper on soils actually only goes down to the top 15 centimetres. So comparing that is actually quite difficult. And there's a few figures there that illustrate that. What are some of the factors that affect the amount of carbon as a stock in the soil? And again, some of this has already been alluded to. The soil type itself is really important, and the high clay-rich soils are going to hold the most carbon, and the thin calcareous soils the least. But there's a huge variation in between, and that in itself is going to be affected by other factors like climate. I've just mentioned that the depth is really also important from a grassland point of view. There's about 60% of the carbon is below 15 centimetre depth, but that will vary again in terms of the soil depth and the soil type. And that is actually very similar to, not quite the same, but similar under woody vegetation like trees and things as well. So a lot of it is at greater depth than just the superficial layer. The vegetation itself actually also has a major impact, which has already been explained today, particularly grasslands with slow-growing species or deep-rooted species like the legumes that have been mentioned, promote high soil organic carbon. And I thought Simon's explanation of some of that was really, really useful. The soil microbes also vary with vegetation, soil type and climate, which was also explained this morning, and that was very helpful as well. And the climate and geographical location are also very important if you think of altitudinal and west to east and north to south differences just in this country, let alone across Europe, influencing productivity, composition rates, for example, but also the length of the growing season and the vegetation type itself. But it should also be noted, because that's very relevant to climate change consideration, that drought can reduce carbon sequestration quite significantly, and has also been shown that carbon stocks in soils can actually be lost in drought conditions as well. Management is also quite important, particularly levels of grazing, levels of cutting, fertilizer additions, slurry additions, and so on. And those are going to affect both vegetation and the soils quite significantly. And time too, it was mentioned this morning that there was potential for a maximum capacity for carbon to be carbon stock in mineral soils in particular. But some of the research that I've found was suggesting that it can take 70 to 100 years or maybe more for a new equilibrium to be reached. So it's still sequestrating carbon for a long time when you're starting particularly off with an arable or a disturbed situation. And then how do you add more carbon to your soils? And bearing in mind, which I should have just said, that the reasons for losses are some of which have already been mentioned, but things like drainage of soils, but also arable land, if it's ploughed, is actually probably losing carbon on average every year. So it's not going to be accumulating more. But so how do you add more carbon? And we've heard from the Jenner experiment, which was one of the ones I did find, about increasing plant diversity, increasing the amount of carbon. And they didn't differentiate between different groups of plants in terms of that addition, whereas some research at the Colt Park experiments, and that's a medium depth soil overlying limestone up in the Yorkshire Dales, adding red clover in particular, and that's one of the species I highlighted on your floodplain diagram as a deeper rooted species, made a significant contribution to carbon sequestration to levels of something like 3.17 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year in the organic matter. And that's a high level and equivalent to ancient woodland, for example, and a lot of other habitats as well. And it's more than you would get in some heathlands, acid soils, acid grasslands. So that is very positive. They've also been found that adding organic manures, not slurry, and not inorganic fertilizers, would also add to the carbon sequestration. But there's a wide range of papers, which is quite interesting, which suggests that a moderate level of nitrogen addition will actually increase carbon sequestration. But if you then start dissecting that out and thinking about it, adding deep-rooted legumes adds nitrogen to the soil. So if you've got a soil with very few legumes, then instead you would need to add some nitrogen fertilizer in order to get that same effect. So from a biodiversity point of view, adding deep-rooted legumes, and you've shown several on your diagrams, which I thought was very useful, should actually enhance your carbon levels without any use of inorganic fertilizers, which of course also decrease biodiversity in terms of a diverse hay meadow. Reducing high levels of stocking is also important, because high stocking levels reduces root growth, and it's also been shown how important that rhizosphere is in producing carbon into the soils. So that a medium or a lower stocking levels are much better for carbon. Reducing drainage effects. I've not found any papers yet actually on taking drains out of areas, and presumably some of your flood meadow grasslands have actually been drained in the past. So I'd be interested to know more about that. And I think it's also really important that some of the levels of grassland sequestration, and there was a paper that I found recently which had various levels of sequestration from down to 0.5 to up to 4 tonnes of carbon per hectare. That is every year, for at least for our sort of generational period of time. And that is equivalent to, or sometimes more than, the average you would get from planting a load of trees. And that's where I think that the balance of grasslands is so important compared with woodland. And if we just move lastly on to some of the benefits that I've sort of drawn out of this, is that first, that biodiversity is going to provide you with other ecosystem services enhancement as well, in terms of soil quality, some water quality, pollination, and so on. There's a much more immediate carbon increase in soil diversification of hay meadows and grasslands in general than you would get from tree planting. And many of the tree planting schemes, particularly if they're disturbing existing soils and vegetation, can take 20 or 30 years or more, or don't ever reach a positive carbon budget, particularly if you're dealing with a peaty soil. I think one of the other advantages for diverse grasslands is that the grazing can continue, foraging can continue, maintaining it in agricultural use and producing food, which is if you had woodland instead, you can't do that. And you can do it on a much, much larger scale. So it can be of more benefit than woodland because of that scale. But you can, of course, as I've shown in the picture at the bottom, which is one of my fields, you can include hedges, you can include scrub edges, you can actually create wood pasture, and so on. So you can have a woodland element into that, which can be very important for other ecosystem services as well. Scale I've already mentioned, but the other thing is also other people have already said is that from a health and well-being point of view, from the landscape and aesthetics point of view, flowered grasslands are magnificent. And I'll leave it at that. The last slide has just got some references on it if anybody wants the additional ones that I've mentioned compared with what I put in the paper that's on the CIWM website. So thank you.
Thank you, Penny. That was absolutely brilliant. We're going to move straight on, but there'll be time for questions later, to our second speaker this morning, who is Jenny Phelps. Jenny has over 30 years experience giving on-farm advice, the last 10 years of which have been with Gloucestershire Farm and Wildlife Advisory Group. And she's going to talk about some current work on the development of a soil and farmland carbon code. Over to you, Jenny. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen okay and hear me okay. Please do say if you can't. I'll just put it onto presentation mode. So we've got the unenviable task of trying to pull all this amazing knowledge and research and everything together to try and create a code for soil carbon, which, as you can see from the presentations today, is incredibly complicated. So I'm going to give you an outline in the next 10 minutes of where we've got to with that, who's involved and how everyone else can get involved. It is a consortium of organisations, academics and practitioners and lots of different people trying to crack this nut. So yeah,
Jenny, can I just interrupt? I can't see your slides. Can anyone else see Jenny's slides?
No, not yet.
Oh, okay. Let's try again. It should be okay, unless you've disabled it so it can't see them. You can present from that end if you want to, because you've got them as well, haven't you?
They're still not.
No, but you have got presenter permissions though.
Yeah. Try again.
This is
that looks better. Can
yes.
you see that?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, perfect. Sorry about that. Thank you. Anyhow, that was my first slide. I was just saying how everyone's welcome to be involved with the development of the code, and hopefully I'll give you some outline as to how that's going to look and who's involved over the next few slides. So really, the whole objective about coming together as a consortium of organisations and the Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group feels incredibly privileged to be part of this and be invited to be part of this, is to try and realise the opportunities for UK farmers that are being sort of like realised around carbon markets internationally. We know there are soil codes and internationally, particularly in America and Australia, and we're working with the developer Robert Packhurst to actually develop those codes, because the UK at the moment can't really create a lot of integrity around that unless we actually get down to the depth of the detail, so that we can understand the complexity of our own soils and also the huge number of different landowners and parcels and how we create projects that might be suitable for that. So what we're really trying to do is to work with all the organisations that have developed the Woodland Code and the Peatland Code, and now the new organisations that are working on the development of codes around other habitat types, which I'll come on to soon, to see if we can actually create an opportunity for this for the UK farmers that does have integrity. And that is something that the landowners can feel that they are de-risked from actually going into carbon trading, where they might not feel that they, how that's going to be quantified in the longer term, and certainly for purchasers who want to have that integrity too. And there seems to be a real run to trade before we've really got this baseline information. So as it says, our ambition is that this is going to be something that's universal, that will have, standard protocols that will enable projects to be developed that can be verified. We want it to be free so that everybody can use it and host it, and we're delighted, having been funded now by the Environment Agency, that will be something that will have integrity and run, as I say, alongside the existing codes, Woodland Code and Peatland Code, and those that are being developed. And we want to make sure that it's there and it's flexible for use so that it fits into markets as they develop, and creates that integrity. So, as I say, the criteria that's been put together, and these slides have the Sustainable Soils Alliance and AgriCarbon have a lot of credit to be taken for putting together a real structure around what it is that we're trying to achieve. And we feel that for this to take place and build this sort of middle ground around, the real world where we want to sequester carbon, the opportunities for investment in carbon, that we have to have some real science, and that it has to be a credible way that we can actually create this opportunity for understanding how we can sequester carbon in our soils from multiple different habitats. But we're focusing primarily our pilots on arable soils, going to herbal lays, and obviously there's an ambition for those herbal lays to become long-term species-rich meadows, even though the mix might be different if that was your long-term objective. It must be something that creates that additionality. And one of the biggest fears that I have at the moment is that there's an opportunity at the moment to create negative drivers for degradation, because a lot of the payments that are actually coming forward seem to be higher for going from arable to woodland than it does to maintaining our brilliant grasslands or restoring arable to grasslands. So we've been looking at international grassland protocols that Robert's given us to create protection for grassland at the moment, something I've raised repeatedly with policymakers around this. We want to explore the permanence of carbon and how that might be. Is that going to be, are we in an arable situation going to be looking at a dynamic system where we look at residual carbon and we do calculations maybe along the lines of RB209 that we use for nitrogen, and is that something that we're going to say, no, this is going to be a permanent transition from an arable soil to a pasture or to a woodland, or obviously with those other codes. But the integrity must be there, and we want to have validators, and we want it to be verifiable, and we want to make sure that all of these the protocols around this and the design is actually completely transparent, and that it involves a huge amount of consultation with people like yourselves on this call, and that is the point when we get to the point we've got something to share, and obviously want to build on brilliant work like Penny's, and actually make sure that we're researching everything that's gone before, so we're not reinventing the wheel, so that we might be able to realise this opportunity. But our ambition really is this centre ground about something that has this integrity, is fair, is transparent and scalable. So where are we at the moment? Okay, so we have got this funding from the Environment Agency and the Investment Readiness Fund, which FWAG is leading on. That gives us an opportunity to run pilots. At the moment, we're creating a governance structure, so aligning it very much, as I said earlier, with the learning from the Woodland Code and the Peatland Code. We've got, as I say, international code drafting experts in Robert, trying to help us to apply what is the way that these international codes might apply to this sort of complex world of the UK geology and soils and land ownership I mentioned earlier, and the dynamic nature that we farm. And we want to look for who is the right validators and maybe bring on board more validators, obviously Soil Association, Organic Farms and Growers, and others doing validation around the Woodland and Peatland Code. And we want to see where is it, who would like to host this so it's available for everyone to use. So again, as I say, a lot of this is going back to look at what exists already, what research is out there, what evidence we can build on. We want to compare and contrast. We want to have a look at, and we've been talking a lot with the farmers who are being invited to trade carbon already using proxy measures. We know there's a lot of those carbon trading organisations are trying to build integrity into what they're doing, so they're very keen to work in this space with us, and we'll certainly learn from them and see what we can do. The pilots that we're designing and working with Associate Professor Nikki Cannon, my friend at the Royal Agricultural University, and Dr. Helena Black from SIUC, and Mark Reed, and obviously Matt Orman from the Sustainable Soils Alliance. And the pilots are going to be based around trying to understand on 20 farms across Gloucestershire, how we can create sort of like a verifiable project by scanning and testing the soil and using multiple different means. So we're going to be using sort of infrared and scanning technology and BES and soil samples. Once we've identified the maximum opportunity for us creating the benefits of taking arable land to herbal land and diverse pasture. There is a website, I'll put it in the chat after I've finished speaking, which has got an update on all of where we are so far. And we'll welcome everyone being part of and feeding in any papers they've got or any form of consultation that we're putting out. We'd love to have your feedback on what we're doing. We do want to link this, if we can, to the development of all the other codes that have been funded under the Investment Readiness Fund, so the Hedgerow Code and the Salt Marsh Code, and we have a sort of really clear sort of idea as to how this might all link to the way that we've been doing our natural capital mapping with our ELMS trial, so using UK habitat verification, and maybe we can plug in codes as they develop into UK habitat types across the UK, building the verification on all the brilliant work of people that have been on this conference. So at the moment, I think that the consortium of organisations that, as I say, this is very much an open, collaborative approach. I've said several times already that we welcome everyone's involvement in this. Really, the credit for bringing this together has to come from to Annie Lee from AgriCarbon, who has dedicated the last 18 months to actually researching the opportunities and trying to create and align people who have specialist knowledge to be able to link it to this. And as I say, it's very much a privilege to work with some extraordinary soil scientists who have been trying to crack this, and the other experts within this field. So I'm hopeful that it's quite a challenge that we've actually taken on board, as you demonstrated highly today, that there is such a complexity around verifying soil carbon and how we do that. I'm very much aware of a lot of tools that are coming on in this space to be able to try and do that more efficiently. And part of our pilot is going to be about trying to cross-reference those tools, to look at all the mapping technologies, to cross-reference that with physical soil samples, to try and get some more integrity around that. And as we say, looking at the whole complexity around soil biology and the structure of soil and its ability to sequester carbon, the impact of climate change might have on that in different localities, and how we might create something that actually enables us to understand the relationships between nitrogen and carbon and soil biology and soil health, and that legacy of enabling residual permanent carbon to be quantified, so that we can actually get investment into soil carbon that's linked directly to healthy biodiversity recovery of ecosystem services, and obviously valuing all of our priority habitats and not just creating carbon for the sake of sequestering carbon. Thank you. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
That's great, Jenny. If you could mute your microphone, thank you. And that's absolutely great. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that there'll be lots of interest in what you've just been saying. We're just going to move on to our final speaker now of this morning's session. Where are we? Our final talk this morning comes from Professor Jo Clark, who is a Professor of Environmental Science at Reading University. And she's going to talk about evaluating the effects of land use and management and soil properties for natural flood management in the Thames Valley as part of the Landwise project. So over to you, Jo. Is she here?
Actually, I haven't managed to find her yet. Jo, if you're in the room, could you please put your hand up?
There's someone with a hand up.
Okay.
Reassuring.
Okay, you can unmute yourself. Is this Jo?
Jo says she needs her camera and mic turned on, is what she says.
Yeah, okay. Jo, you can now turn your mic and camera on.
Hello. Welcome.
Hi, Jo. Thank you. We can hear you now. Thank you.
Good stuff. Hi, thank you for the invitation to talk. So my background is actually sort of a soil and catchment scientist who works a lot on the carbon cycle, and I've kind of infiltrated, literally and metaphorically, the flood management community over the last few years. So What I'd like to present to you today is some summary results we've got from a project we've had running for the last 4 years that will illustrate to you how the carbon cycle and the water cycle are actually very linked. And for me, natural flood management in the context of land use and management is actually about managing the carbon cycle to manage the water cycle. So I've got a large number of co-authors here that will probably take me 20 minutes to read through. So please note that what I'm presenting today isn't just my work, it's actually the work of others as well. And so we've got a large team, over 40 project partners, over 30 researchers working on this project that started in 1997-98. We're going to finish next year. We've had extensions due to COVID impacts, and the large number of people who got involved in this project is testament to the number of people you have to have in the conversation when you're talking about natural flood management. So I'll give you an overview of the project as a whole, and then just to set the context of what I'm going to show you today. So the idea of the project is that we've got 3 work packages around collecting data. So we've got work package 1, where we're collecting local knowledge and technical knowledge to create scenarios for natural flood management. Work package 2 is making some measurements in the field of soil properties. Work package 3 is we're making measurements using satellites and remote sensing techniques in the field, and that's getting integrated in some modelling work and being developed on a web tool. So what I'm going to show you today is mainly work package 2, some of the field work, and also some of the work we've got from local knowledge around how we're using and managing our floodplains compared to other parts of the catchment. I thought that might be useful to share. And so the kind of questions we're looking at are how effective are different land-based NFM measures at increasing infiltration, evaporative loss and below ground water storage in different locations in lowland catchments. So that's the question all the work I'm showing today is relating to. And then we've got other questions that we're looking at with modelling about how this scales up. And we're effectively testing a theoretical framework that was proposed by Simon Dadson and colleagues, where they suggested that land use and management was only really effective at reducing small flood peaks and wouldn't be very effective at larger peaks. So we're having it, but there's not a lot of evidence to look at this. This is just what I think based on what's available. So we're having a look at this to see if actually land use and management can do more for these bigger floods by looking at a range of different events over time. So we're working in the Thames Valley. It used to be called West Thames, and then the Environment Agency used to have a West Thames office, and now they just have a Thames office. And then the Environment Agency have told me to stop calling it West Thames, and so I've gone to Thames Valley now because it is Thames Valley too, and it's something that people seem to identify with more. So this is our kind of focus area. We've got particular catchments that we're looking at. We've been working with particular catchment partnerships, and we're sort of doing modelling across different scales identified here. The key thing to note is the difference in geology in the area. We've got carbonate geology associated with chalk and limestone, very permeable, very shallow soils with this. There's a little bit of sandstone, tends to be the acid geology associated with heathlands, and then we've got the mudstone, so the sort of flatter lands around our floodplains, quite clay-rich soils that tend to have high runoff rates. So if you look at the soil map for the area, this is the sort of technical national nursery soil associations. We've got lots of diversity in our soils and represented by the different colours here. But broadly speaking, you've got the shallow soils that are linked to the map units that start with 3. You've got the earths that are linked to the map units that start with 5 and are shown in the pinky colours. And then the floodplain soils are the ones here in the map units that start with 8 and are the bluish soils. Now, there's a lot of complexity with the soils, and how do you make sense of this when you're trying to study it in a project with budget constraints? So we've kind of taken these sort of higher technical categories. We've been using soilscapes as well, because the language in which soils are described in soilscapes is much more accessible than the very academic technical terms like paleosoil and argillic brown earth. Doesn't necessarily have a lot of meaning to people beyond immediate soil scientists. We've also, through this project, it's a participatory project, we've got farm advisors involved. So Jenny herself is involved in the project and Jenny's team, and through that they've been educating us, the university researchers, about the language of RB209, which is much more familiar and useful with farmers. So shallow soils, medium soils, deep clay soils. And we found that the language we use and how we talk about soils it's a no-brainer really, but it really affects how we interact with farmers and what people can share and what people can know. And this terminology really needs to be taken seriously. So if you take one thing away from this talk, it's that RB209 is a good way to talk about soils with farmers. Okay. So the field survey concept, basically we ran a broad scale field survey of 150 fields where we measure soil properties so across these fields, focusing on the soil surface. So if you think about soil as like a bucket, you know, it's a bucket that can store water. What we're measuring in different fields are the properties of that bucket. So how much, you know, how deep is it? How much of it is filled with material? How much is full of air? So that's what we're measuring with the broad scale survey. We're currently doing a detailed survey of very specific locations where we're looking at things like infiltration and water storage and how water flow changes over time. So that's ongoing at the moment. So what I'm going to do today is focus on the broad scale survey, so the survey of different properties. And we had over 150 fields sampled across 40 farms over 2019-20. We looked at 4 different land uses. So we looked at arable with a grass rotation and arable without a grass rotation. And this was a steer we got from the farmers as being a key question a lot of them had, was whether or not to have a grass rotation. Should they have livestock in their farm or not? A number of farmers in the area got rid of livestock over the last 20, 30 years. And some of them are actually bringing the livestock back because they believe it's beneficial to their soils. So this was something that we took a steer from farmers to look at. We also looked at permanent grassland and also broadleaf woodland, and then to try and take that complexity in soils and make it into something more easy to study. We had the sort of 5 aggregated categories that map onto these sort of 3 RB29 classifications of heavy soils, medium soils, and shallow soils. So the sort of heavy, kind of deep clay and silty soils. And we're looking at properties like bulk density, texture, structure, and organic matter. So this is kind of a map using these aggregated classes. So you've got a simplified soil map of the area. And again, the floodplain soils here are kind of shown in the pink areas there. And you can see where we've kind of been able to sample across the area to capture some of that variation. And so from this data, I wanted to just explain a little bit about how the statistics works. So we're analysing these data using mixed models, and it's kind of a hierarchical model as well, where we've got our response, which is bulk density, and we can split it into lots of different factors that explain that variation, and we can see which ones have a significant effect on controlling the variation and which ones that don't. So we can look at things like the soil type, the land use, the position in the field, whether it was on a tram line or not, because we looked at that. And then we can look at other things that we didn't control for, which were the crop type, that could also affect it. We can also look at the farm, the researcher, the clay content of the soil, the loss of condition. So all these other factors that affect the variation, and we can put it into one big statistical model and examine it. So just pulling out some of the key findings from this analysis. So looking first at bulk density. So bulk density is how much soil, if you had a bean can and you drove it into the soil, how much soil is in that bean can, or how squashed is the soil, so how compacted is it. So a bigger bulk density means the soil is more compacted, and it means it's less likely that the water is going to sink in if it rains. So we found that actually land use has a much more significant effect on the bulk density than the soil type. Although both the effects are significant, it matters more whether you have a grassland or a woodland than whether it's a clay or a loam. There is some variation in there. You can see the floodplain soils tended to have a lower bulk density than the others. What's interesting in the context of this conference, you can see, so the letters show groups that are similar is that the grassland and the woodland are actually quite similar in their bulk density, so they're both in group C, whereas the arable no grass, arable with grass, they're both in group A, which is similar, and the arable with grass and grassland are also in similar too. So that's an interesting point. In terms of organic matter, again, the effect of land use is much stronger than the effect of soil type, although again they're significant. And the floodplain soils tended to have higher organic matter content than other soils in the area. And the woodland had much higher than the grassland here. What's important to note is this correlation that we have between bulk density and organic matter, where as our organic matter content increases, our bulk density goes down. So the implication is, as we increase the organic matter inputs into the soil by changing the vegetation and the land use, we put in organic matter in, we're actually making these soils maybe less compacted, and it makes it easier for the water and the rainfall to seep in. And so from a management perspective, this is basically saying that into the Thames area, we can, through natural flood management policies and practices linked to changing our land use and management, we can manipulate and change the soil property to make it easier for the soils to accept rainfall and by changing their properties. So that's kind of a sort of positive message there about what we can do. It's not just a case of we're stuck with clay soils that are going to produce runoff and there's nothing we can do about it. We can actually have a look at these. I was talking about all these different management effects. So that's some initial statistical analysis. We're still working on the stats to actually unpick the effect of all these different management effects we've got from our soil survey. So that's sort of work in progress here. Taking a step back and looking at some of the wider implications now. So some work that Samantha Broadmeadow's done, looking at technical mapping, policy and farmer knowledge. And again, this is drawing on the soil data. So we've got the map in the corner there, map A, the green one, that shows the maps where countryside stewardship targets woodland creation at the moment. And again, this is picking up some of those clay soils, the heavy clay soils. And also they're working with natural processes one, and again, it's picking up the clay soils and the floodplain soils. And Samantha's compared this with some farmer interviews and surveys we've done, and what she's found is that actually there's quite a good alignment between the soil maps and what farmers report, the soils farmers report on their farms at a farm scale. There's not so good agreement at a field scale with the soil map, but at a farm scale, but there is good agreement there. And that these policies seem to be targeted in the areas where farmers are telling us they're having problems managing their water. She's also done some extra mapping looking at structural degradation, which picks out the importance of these clay on chalk soils as a risk area that hadn't been identified previously. In terms of management, in terms of what farmers are growing, one thing that's popped out that's quite interesting, so these deep clay, deep silty soils, they're the floodplain soils, is actually that the grass lays are really present on these floodplain and the sort of clay soils in the areas, and not on the chalk soils, the medium soils. It seems to be absent from those areas in the catchment. And also in terms of tillage, we've actually got, ploughing. A lot of farmers talk about the need to plough heavy soils as well. So we've still got conventional tillage. There's a lot of reduced tillage going on, but there's no conventional tillage on these medium soils that are on the chalk, on the sort of the chalky loamy soils as well. So in summary, floodplain soils in the Thames Valley are groundwater glaze or deep clay, deep silty soils if you're using the language of RV209. The soil surface properties affect the runoff generation, and we found that land use had a greater effect than soil type on changing soil properties, bulk density and organic matter, and that higher organic matter is associated with lower bulk density, and floodplain soils tended to have higher organic matter than the others. So there is a good association between the policy target areas and farmer knowledge on soil issues around water management, but we also need to look at clay soils and chalk because they've actually been overlooked. The assumption that all clay soils, all chalky soils are permeable, and actually some of them aren't. And there are some differences in crops and tillage on floodplain soils compared to other soils in the area. And the need to plough, the use of grass lays and maize but our analysis is ongoing. So on that note, I'll end and hand over to the discussion. So thank you for the opportunity for sharing some of these findings, and yes, watch this space. We'll be coming back with more to share.
Thanks very much, Jo. We're slightly over time now, but I still want to allow 10 minutes of questions. I apologise if people need to go, but if we could put the three speakers from this morning back on the screen, then I'll take questions. Does anyone want to ask a question of our last three speakers? Have we got any hands up? In fact, is there anything from the chat? David, can I ask you to let me know if there's anything in the chat that could be? It must be lunchtime.
It means we're all perfectly clear.
Yeah. Oh, here you go. There's a question from Anne.
You can unmute yourself now, Anne.
Thanks. It's a question about drainage. So we know, that the diversity is linked to hydrology and of grasslands. So I'm just wondering, what are people's views on where, fields are getting wetter, some of the fields are drained, they're managed as hay meadows. What should we be doing? What should our advice be around drainage to maintain that diversity, to maintain the hay crop versus the sort of flood management type approach?
Well, I'm happy to take that if that's okay. Hi Anne. We do a huge amount of work in relation to looking at the flow of water across the whole water body, because we've found, particularly with North Meadow Cricklade as an example, which is one of the research sites that was presented earlier, that if you don't look at the downstream blockages, infrastructure, road infrastructure, culverts that are full of silt, you've actually got, this is what we've been saying for nearly 15 years, communities and farmers need to be able to go out and map and understand and share with partners all the local infrastructure that has an impact on the flow of water, because we can't manage soils without managing water. And if we can look across the whole water body, we can look at where we can store it, where we can create wet woodlands and wet meadows. But actually, to do that, we need to understand, what human infrastructure has been put across that water body over hundreds of years. So yeah, under the projects we've been doing, the project, we mapped over 20 villages and 20 water bodies and showed that there's literally thousands of tiny infrastructure points that need to be managed locally for, the flow of water. And with North Meadow Cricklade, there was definitely an impact of some of the dereliction of downstream drainage. So yes, I would say yes, you definitely need to look at the wider landscape, and there's, if you link that to the catchment partnerships, you can find lots of resources quite often to help with that from highways and other people, water companies, to help with that restoration of infrastructure. Thank you.
We have a question from Rachel Remnant. I can do this. I've made you a presenter, Rachel, so I think you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So my question is, I manage some peatland valley floodplain meadows in Winchester on the Itchen Valley, and for the first time ever, we haven't been able to take a hay cut this year due to the amount of torrential rain that we had and rising groundwater on the Itchen Valley. So I imagine this is a function of climate change. So when we're talking about permeability of soils and drainage, that is just not a possibility for those people who are on floodplain systems where you've got groundwater coming up. So I'm just wondering, is this being factored into some of this analysis about soil carbon and everything that we're trying to achieve for these habitats? This is MGA M22. If we're not going to be able to carry out the management, and we're even struggling with livestock grazing at the moment, we're really on a knife edge, in terms of managing welfare, because the fields are actually quite hazardous to walk across, even in Wellington boots. So that's how wet it's been all summer. So it was just, is that being factored in with climate change, increased rainfall and groundwater rising?
Does anyone want to have a go at that? Joe.
So with it, if you've got peat, it's already telling you it's very wet.
Can't hear you very well, Joe. Could you speak
Okay.
up or... That's better, yeah.
Is that better? Yeah, so if you've got peat, it's already telling you it's very wet because the peat needs saturated conditions to form, and not all of our floodplains are peaty. Yeah, so I think you've got that kind of side of it as well, and so it is a tricky issue, and this year has been quite wet. But then there is a question around how we manage the peaty areas, and maybe that's different to how we might manage areas that are more clay rich and some of the systems that Jenny's referring to. So I think there's probably need more differentiation between how we look at our floodplains and whether they should be managed in that way. I know there's a fen, we're working at Greywell Fen at the moment with South East Water, and they're actually about to stop drinking water abstraction because it's been damaging plants, and that's raising water levels, and they're clearing trees from the site as well. And yes, there's a question there also around grazing. So I think the issues you raise are really important ones, and I think the response is actually we need to be more specific in our differentiation around policies, and we need to recognise peat as a separate soil class to mineral soils, and that's becoming more common. It's more done in a sort of uplands lowlands context, but we need to do it in a lowlands context as well.
Thank you, Joe. Does either of the other two want to add anything to that? No. Okay. No. Are there any more questions? I can't see any hands up at the moment. No. Well, in that case, I think it's... Oh, there's one. We'll take one more. Who's that? God, I've got to find you now. Oh, it's Sue. Shall I make you a presenter, Sue? Can't find you now. This is what happens. Our tech support have gone, so we're just alone. If that was
speak, Sue.
Yeah, you should be able to. Oh, hello. Hi, Hazel. Thank you. Can you speak, Sue?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Well, I've been absent and I'm sorry. I haven't got a question. I was just trying to get back in as chair. So I have no question. And I was going to apologise for my appalling internet connectivity and sum up at some point, because I haven't actually managed to listen to most of the presentations, which has been fab. So I'm so sorry that I haven't actually seen you all face to face. There is one question in the chat if you want to pick one last one up, and it's about grazing animals. That nobody has yet said anything about grazing animals and the effect on microbial populations and consequently carbon storage. The questioner, Phil Wilson, says that surely grazing and dunging will have a huge effect, and grazing is a major and traditional management process. So if anybody wants to pick any of that up, then that'll be a nice perhaps end question, because we are running out of time, I think, Emma. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely, completely agree. And we've been working through our ELMS trial, which all links into the soil development of the soil code, around the UK habitat classification and the management of land. And we've been adding in with Bill and Joe, who developed the UK habitat classification, all of the management codes around livestock, so including things like mob grazing to get ecosystem attribution from those. But I think it's very much understood for those of us as practitioners, particularly learning from farmers on the ground who are doing a lot of trials, that livestock are integral to that soil biology, as you say. And actually, as we heard from a previous presenter, that seems to be very integral to the ability to sequester carbon. So definitely livestock in the system. So you have our support on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Lovely. I don't think there's any more questions from anybody there, so it falls to me as an absent chair to sum up the presentations from this morning, which is actually quite difficult to do because they were so brilliant. And I personally have learned an awful lot from these presentations, because I think it's tied together a lot of the themes, particularly about carbon sequestration, about getting a code, which we all seem to be very much behind. It seems to be essential. Some brilliant case studies. Thank you, National Trust, for those inputs on that. I think that Team National Trust can really lead us forward on this. I was also quite aware of the knowledge base here that the soil scientists are bringing to the party, without which we cannot carry out the management of these floodplain meadows. And particularly, as you know, I'm interested in education and training. And I actually held a 2-minute silence when they removed soil ecology from the national curriculum, sorry, not the national curriculum, for the A level in geography, which was a stalwart for years and years and years. And now everything we got in the introductions from David Going on the soil horizons, that structure just isn't in our syllabuses anymore. So it's falling to the universities such as Harper Adams, such as the rest of you, to bring us forward. So thank goodness Reading are in on it. Thank goodness so many people are there to raise our awareness of soil and take it forward to continue to research. That's really, really important. So really, I can't sum up each individual presentation, but just to say an enormous thank you. All of them have engaged a lot of people who are questioning either face-to-face or by the chat. So that's really, really great. And I think that just is a real testament of how we managed to do this. I think that's really, really good. I think the last thing I need to see is to say something about the administration. And one of the bits was this morning session, but we will actually be beginning again at 5 o'clock, and that will give us a fabulous next stage, because there we'll be talking about restoration, and there will be a question time session at the end. So if you've got more questions on anything that you've been raising this morning that has a particular yen to thinking about restoration, which is what we're all agreeing is necessary, and obviously we need to choose which sites are most suitable for that. But we've got some fabulous case studies and some thinking about what we might do that. So please, a reminder to come back. So it might be the end of today and we might be able to stretch and release a little bit of energy and go for our own comfort breaks. But please come back. This conference just goes from better to better to better. So all we can do is learn more. Thank you very much. And that's the end of this morning's session.